Mary Magdalene has been a muse throughout the centuries. The images that we have of her create this richly paradoxical portrayal of a woman who embodies so many different aspects of what it is to be fully and truly human. She's a towering figure in the New Testament. In fact, there are more descriptions of her in the New Testament than of any other woman, including Jesus' own mother. And yet the stories that have evolved over the centuries also have added so many other different elements to who this person is. We've had a wide array of stories and images, paintings that have depicted her as an outward spiritual leader, someone who goes and preaches and teaches and has a life of action in the world. And then we have these other collection of myths that have evolved of her as a deeply contemplative hermit, someone who's seeking profound inner truth in an inward way. She's also someone who, throughout the centuries, has embodied a yearning and a questing for the spiritual life. This idea of seeking transcendence has been something that has been such a part of her legend and mythology. And yet, ironically, at the same time, she is the figure more than any other figure in the New Testament who embodies a sense of sensuality, of a physical existence, and who carries with her a connotation of a sexual life as well. We see that repeatedly in art throughout the centuries. She's also someone who holds the polarities of both being deeply emotional. In fact, the very name Magdalene is the root of the English word maudlin, to be excessively sentimental, emotional, or weeping. And so in art throughout the centuries, tears are one of her symbols. And yet, at the very same time, she's someone who has also developed as a figure who embodies learning and questing for the life of the mind. So in art museums throughout the world, you will also see Mary Magdalene in a deeply contemplative mode, poring over the pages of an open book. All of these polarities, these different aspects, intellectual, emotional, sensual, spiritual, are woven together in the fabric of this one woman. It's an important thing to ask the question, who is this woman? Who is this Magdalene? And what does she know? Those are some of the lines in the beginning of Mark Adamo's opera, The Gospel of Mary Magdalene. Our earliest depictions of Mary Magdalene come from the New Testament, from the canonical Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In those stories, there are 12 references to her, and they paint a remarkably consistent portrayal. She is the woman that the Gospel writers agree was the faithful follower and disciple of Jesus, faithful watching his suffering, being a witness to the crucifixion. She's also the faithful disciple who comes to his tomb to anoint his body, to prepare it for burial. And she is the faithful disciple who was present to discover that this extraordinary mystery had transpired. In the Gospel of Mark, she encounters the empty tomb, and she and the other women flee in terror and fear. In the Gospel of Matthew, they encounter an angel, and they are told about a resurrection and then later fall at his feet. In the Gospel of John, she alone comes to the garden, to the empty tomb, to anoint the body. And there she discovers this extraordinary experience where she encounters Jesus and mistakes him for the gardener and is the sole first witness for the resurrection. That's who we have in the Bible. Mary Magdalene as faithful disciple, faithful follower, and witness both to death and suffering and to new life and joy. There is one other reference in the Gospel of Luke, and it's a curious one. It says that she was a woman of means who was enabling Jesus' ministry. It also mentions that she had been plagued, troubled by 7 demons, and had been cured of that. They had been cast out in one of Jesus' many stories of healing. But still, nowhere in those depictions do we have stories of her as a lascivious sinner, a prostitute, an adulteress. Those stories and those myths came later in a confusion of Marys. There was another Mary, another disciple of Jesus. She was the sister of Martha and Lazarus, who both sat at Jesus' feet and who later anointed him for his death. There was another woman who also anointed. This was Luke's unnamed sinner. And over the centuries, these three women, Mary Magdalene, Mary of Bethany, and the unnamed sinner of the Gospel of Luke, all became confused in the popular imagination. They also became confused with a real-life penitent sinner, Mary of Egypt. Now, she's an extraordinarily interesting figure, and she really was a real-life penitent prostitute. By the 6th century, all of these women had been muddled about in the public imagination. And in a 6th century Easter sermon by Pope Gregory, he declared that Mary of Bethany, Mary Magdalene, Luke's unnamed sinner were all one and the same woman. And from that moment on, for 1400 years, we've had in the West this idea of Mary Magdalene being caught up somehow with sexual sin. In the East, that was never the case. She is known as the apostle to the apostles. She's revered for being the faithful follower of Jesus, the witness. In early Christianity, she was much more than that to many, many different communities. There was not just one version of who Jesus was in the early centuries. There were literally hundreds of communities that had their own stories about the message and the meaning of Jesus' life, death. In some of these communities, Mary Magdalene had a very particular and special place. She was not just a faithful follower, she was the disciple who understood Jesus' message the best. She was referred to as the woman who knew all. In 1945, in the caves of Nag Hammadi, an extraordinary discovery was made, and many of these lost texts were found. In them, Mary Magdalene's place is elevated to one of even greater spiritual authority than she held in the New Testament. This forms part of the basis of Mark Adamo's Gospel of Mary Magdalene. In one of the stories that was found in Nag Hammadi, the Gospel of Philip, Mary Magdalene is referred to as Jesus' koinonos, a companion. Now, modern-day scholars are in a raging debate about whether this implies that there was a sexual element to their relationship or not. The portrayal in the Gospel of Philip is clear that she held a very particular place, a very important place of at least spiritual intimacy. This is one of the threads that Mark Adamo weaves in his opera as he envisions a relationship between Mary Magdalene and Jesus that has a very intimate component to it. Another element that's revealed in these texts is the rivalry between Peter and Mary Magdalene. In some of the stories, Mary confesses that she's afraid of Peter, for he hates her sex. In the Gospel of Thomas, Peter actually is reputed to have said, "Make Mary leave us, for women are not worthy of the life." These early texts are important because they point to the conflicts that were inherent amongst different Christian communities. They raise the question about what is the place of women's leadership, and they certainly raise the question about what was the nature of the relationship between Mary Magdalene and Jesus. This is one of the most important elements of Mark Adamo's opera. He weaves together the character of Mary Magdalene, drawing on these texts where she is the eager disciple, curious, seeking, and searching. And he takes that thread and he weaves it together with other elements of tradition. The tradition of the Song of Songs, an erotic love poem that has been part of Mary Magdalene's celebrations and her feast days from very early centuries. A woman questing, yearning, longing for union with the beloved as she searches through the city streets. These are the threads that Mark Adamo weaves together then. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John with their portrayal of the faithful witness, particularly of the woman in the Gospel of John who encounters Jesus in the garden and is the first witness to the resurrection. the theme of longing and yearning and sensual embodiment that we have both from the Song of Songs and from the misidentification throughout the centuries with a sensuous, sinful, and fallen woman. And finally, these rich and provocative texts that were rediscovered in our own times in Egypt that reveal a woman of extraordinary spiritual hunger. To explore the fascinating figure of Mary Magdalene in greater depth, go to www.mythsofmarymagdalene.com.